Olá. Os líderes de 5 países considerados emergentes, que representam quase 3 bilhões de pessoas, têm um encontro marcado no final de julho em Joanesburgo. Eles vão participar da 10ª reunião de cúpula dos Brics, grupo que reuniu Brasil, Rússia, Índia, China e África do Sul. Depois da primeira cúpula, realizada em 2009 na cidade de Ekaterimburgo, na Rússia, pouca gente podia prever que os 5 países manteriam o grupo unido por tanto tempo. 10 anos depois, o que significam hoje os Brics? Para debater o tema, estão conosco o embaixador da África do Sul, Mashimbye, e o professor de Relações Internacionais, Oliver Stuenkel, da Fundação Getúlio Vargas. Muito obrigado a vocês pela presença. Eu gostaria de saber qual é o significado para a África do Sul de receber a 10ª reunião de cúpula dos Brics.
Thank you very much for having us here. First, I must state that we are very fortunate and excited to be hosting the 10th Brics Summit in South Africa. We need to recall that we are a young democracy. We are a young nation, just over 2 decades. And the father of our nation, Nelson Mandela, taught us that there can never be a sea of poverty, a sea of success, a sea of hope, a sea of peace, and islands of poverty. You need to always create inclusive society. You always need to create global partnerships, because he always insisted that if you want to go far, you need to go together in partnerships, in global partnerships. If you want to go fast, you can go alone, but it is never sustainable. So we're looking forward to this summit. A lot of projects have been achieved, and we think the teachings of our founding father are finding a platform and a place within the nations of the globe. That the teachings of Ubuntu, the teachings of inclusivity are accepted by such important and big nations.
Pois é, embaixador, a África do Sul é o mais recente integrante dos Brics. Eu imagino que seu país deve se sentir honrado de sediar a 10ª cúpula do grupo.
It is a very big honor. We intend to use this 10th BRICS Summit and our chairmanship of the BRICS to celebrate the teachings of our founding father, Nelson Mandela. We celebrate his centenary this year. And in his teachings, Nelson Mandela has always insisted that peace and prosperity comes from an inclusive growth. You can't live in prosperity and your neighbor lives in poverty. Only when you are all in an inclusive growth can you live in peace and in harmony. So it is a very big achievement for us, but we know that there is far more we can build on this 10th anniversary.
Professor Stuenkel, o senhor escreveu um livro sobre os Brics, no qual o senhor menciona que, depois do primeiro encontro de cúpula na Rússia, pouca gente acreditava que haveria um segundo encontro. Nós estamos chegando ao 10º encontro. A que o senhor atribui essa resiliência dos Brics?
Well, I think there are 2 main reasons. The first is that the BRICS grouping emerged at a time when the established powers were incapable of providing global public goods. There was an economic crisis, and it was a particular moment when the BRICS countries were able to provide a good that the global community needed, which was fresh capital to overcome the financial crisis. At the same time, I think this is the second issue, the BRICS countries believed that they were not, there wasn't enough space in the existing institutions, so they believed at the time that working together would create more benefits than asking for reform individually. And I think out of that came a perception which was quite interesting, I think, in the 5 societies, that these countries knew very little of each other, and that creating a grouping could allow them to get to know each other much more. And I think over the past 10 years, we've seen tremendous progress in bringing societies together, in strengthening economic relations, in coordinating diplomatic activities on many levels. So I think in that sense there was a perception among the members of the group that there was a lot of benefits being produced and relatively low cost. So it didn't impose a restriction on the countries, but it allowed the countries to look over the past decades at specific issues and identify potential for cooperation.
Nós estamos aqui olhando, então, esses números principais dos BRICS, em que nós temos a população de cada país e a renda per capita de cada país, com os respectivos chefes de governo. Nós podemos ver que os números são imensos, mas também são bem diferentes em termos de população, em termos de renda per capita. Embaixador, existe uma crítica muito forte aos BRICS, segundo a qual os países que integram o grupo são muito diferentes. Por isso, eles não deveriam estar juntos, não teriam motivos para estar juntos. Como é que o senhor responde a essa crítica?
No, first, actually, there is far more that brings us together than that which separates us. As citizens, as global citizens, we still face so many similar challenges, socio-economic challenges. And in this globalized world today, you can't have local solutions only. You would need to learn from the experiences of others. The levels of development globally have not been the same, including amongst the members of BRICS. There are some who have found solutions to problems that whose solutions have not been found in other countries. I'll give you an example. Brazil has similar problems as we have, but this society of a huge population, in modern times, they have been able to take out of the poverty line millions of people into into the middle class. The solutions South Africa would benefit from. I'm sure India would benefit from. I'll give you an example. Brazil has done agriculture very well. We are also very good in agriculture, but we have been good in commercial agriculture, not necessarily in small-scale family agriculture. There is something to learn from Brazil, and I'm sure there are many examples in all these countries. So I think there is more that brings us together rather than divide us.
As diferenças entre os BRICS, elas fazem o grupo mais forte ou mais fraco?
Well, it's a very interesting question because from the very beginning, there's been, I think, a near consensus among established thinkers of international affairs that the BRICS grouping would make no sense and that eventually it would stop meeting because these countries are too different from each other. And a lot of people pointed to different political systems and different geographic realities, different, different size, very different types of challenges, but also they pointed to the tensions between countries and said, you can't have a grouping of 5 countries if you have 2 countries that still have a border conflict going on and so on. And I think there's 2 things to look at here. The first is that the Western point or perspective of cooperation depends on depends on being very similar. So the G7 are very similar in many ways, right? They are a similar part of the world. They have similar political systems, racially, from a religious point of view, economically. So they're kind of similar. So from a Western point of view, people looked at BRICS and said, how can cooperation be possible? Because there are, of course, differences, religious differences, etc. And in a way, I think we must look at the BRICS as kind of the model of cooperation that we'll look at in the 21st century, because the G7 will no longer have the economic importance in the 21st century to actually take decisions that matter for the entire world. So the kind of cooperation we're developing now is increasingly going to look like intra-BRICS cooperation between countries that are very different from each other, and really where you need to work a bit towards identifying potential for cooperation, which is actually working, but it's not an easy process because, again, a lot of the policy-making elites don't know each other that well, as would be the case between France and Germany. And the second thing is that the conflict or the potential risk of conflict in the future, and I'm looking particularly at China and India here, are actually, to my mind, not a reason why we should not have the BRICS grouping, but are another argument for why the BRICS grouping is so important, because it creates an additional platform where these countries can work together, where future leaders who are in the policymaking structures can talk together. So we have tens of meetings, minister-level meetings every year in the BRICS context, cultural programs, universities, think tanks, etc. So they will also bring these countries together and reduce the risk of tensions that could emerge out of misinterpretation or lack of contact.
It is our diversity that unites us rather than divide us. And I think in this modern world, there can be one way of dealing with global issues, including issues of development. I think the tendency to only pursue self-interest is not workable. Multilateralism I think is helpful, and it can't be viewed as only in one direction only. There must be partnerships like this, inclusive growth, inclusive societies, and inclusive global partnerships. I think is the answer to the many problems that we face.
Vocês acham que talvez haja tipo de preconceito dos países ocidentais em relação aos BRICS ao dizerem que eles são tão diferentes?
I wouldn't want to call it prejudice. I would want to call it a different school of thought. It can be business as usual. The global, the way we look at the globe, our outlook, our philosophy of the globe has to be different, and we should be allowed to be different. BRICS was not there was not brought together to replace any global order, but it was to enhance development of societies, especially those societies that feel together in the global south and in the areas where they are. So I would think it's a different global viewpoint rather than a prejudice. I don't think it deserves of that tag.
Yeah, I would agree. I don't think there was sort of a concerted effort to undermine. At the same time, I think there is, particularly in the area of international relations, I think there was a traditional Western-centric perception that you have sort of Western-led groupings that this is sort of to provide global public goods and to project stability, and that if you had countries, non-Western countries, that would work together, that this would somehow destabilize the international system. And I think it's quite interesting when we look at the at most analyses, early analyses of the BRICS, the question was always, are the BRICS destabilizing international order? Are the BRICS overthrowing international order? And I think when we look at the actual declarations, I mean, they're quite mainstream in a way, right? I mean, the BRICS countries are pointing out particular issues where we can work together, but there's no desire to revolutionize the international system. There's just, I think, a desire to establish lines of communication between countries that didn't have that much communication before. So in a sense, I think it's the criticism against the BRICS grouping is a reflection of perhaps a broader bias, which I think implies an excessive focus perhaps on the agency, on the leadership of Western countries. But now we can see that there is equally, I think, a lot of benefit to be had from a model of cooperation between developing countries.
Nós temos aqui agora vídeo que vamos mostrar do encontro preparatório dos ministros de Relações Exteriores que aconteceu na África do Sul, nesse mês de junho. A declaração final dos ministros contém uma forte defesa do multilateralismo, das Nações Unidas, da Organização Mundial do Comércio e do direito internacional. Os ministros criticaram a nova onda de protecionismo e o sistemático impacto de medidas unilaterais que são incompatíveis com as regras da OMC e contrariam o comércio global e o crescimento econômico. Então, eu tenho uma pergunta aos dois. Qual pode ser o papel dos BRICS na defesa de uma ordem global mais aberta? Mr. Stuenkel, please.
Well, I think there's a role to be had, and as I initially said, I think one of the reasons why BRICS emerged and why it still exists today is that because of the shift of power away from the West, there is a necessity, I think, for institutional mechanisms to adapt. And that doesn't mean that there will be, again, an overthrow of international order, but I think there need to be platforms where these countries which didn't have an established place in those structures, like the G7 or the IMF or the World Bank, you know, they weren't there from the very beginning. And I think absolutely, I mean, we see now I think the United States in particular as a country that generates a lot of instability, that rather than defending the rules and norms which have contributed so much to generating wealth and development, actually questioning them. So I think it's quite natural that we see, to some extent, an emergence of a leadership vacuum. There's a vacuum, and I think there's a demand for countries to provide global public goods, to lead debates. And this is why I think the BRICS Summit is so important, because it's BRICS countries that actually set the agenda, that bring new topics that are being discussed. The ambassador mentioned Ubuntu here. I mean, these are issues, these are ideas that are that should be discussed beyond South Africa. I mean, and I think the BRICS Summit in that sense can be a platform to provide those debates, but also how do we rethink development, etc. Absolutely, I think if you look at the last declarations of all the summits, they always defend unequivocally the globalization, the maintenance of open borders, the World Trade Organization. So I think particularly in that moment, I think now we have this very acrimonious G7 summit. We will see, I think, that the importance of the BRICS grouping as being a group of 5 countries from every single place, every region of the world, resolutely defending globalization, I think will send a positive signal.
Senhor embaixador, então parece que o grupo dos BRICS, afinal, está defendendo uma ordem mais aberta, está defendendo um comércio mais aberto, um pouco ao contrário do que aconteceu na última reunião do grupo dos países ricos, não?
I think BRICS makes a very valid and progressive contribution to the global order. It brings in a united voice that has not been heard before, unlike the traditional ones. It is not a group of anarchists. It is a group that says, let's review the traditional institutions as they were. Let's find a more inclusive, new way of doing things. It can't be business as usual. The evidence is a very uneven development of societies. The world is still beset with hundreds and hundreds of millions of people who are poverty-stricken. We have to find solutions that alleviate this state of affairs. BRICS says, let's look at how the structures of the globe are. Let's look at the reform of the United Nations Security Council. Let's look at the IMF. Let us look at the funding models, because development cannot be something that is not enhanced in a funding that is sensitive to conditions in various areas. There might be a different way altogether in traditional establishments in understanding how you fund development, for instance. It may not be the same in Belgium. It might not be similar as the conditions in India or South Africa.
Vocês acham que a voz dos BRICS tem sido ouvida no mundo? O que foi que o BRICS conseguiu de fato até hoje, nesses 10 anos?
Well, I think there's been, as I said initially, I think we've, above all, have had, I think, a complete change in the way we look at international order, because the BRICS, the first grouping of non-Western countries, or countries majority made up of non-Western countries that are taking the lead and that are not sort of asking for outside help, like it has been in the past, for example, when sort of developing countries joined to ask for more development aid from the West. I mean, these are countries that are setting the agenda on a whole range of issues. So I think giving, basically, as the ambassador was saying, sort of providing voice to the global South, in that sense, as you may say, has been tremendously important. So we have several meetings now. The G7 is no longer seen as kind of the cockpit of the world, and I think it no longer should be, because we now have a much more multipolar economic and political order. So in that sense, it has helped, I think, the system to adapt to something new. The second thing is I think the ties between countries are now much more intense. They're much more engaged. Particularly in the case of Brazil, I mean, Brazil knew very little about the other BRICS countries. I think BRICS helps overcome that. Particularly in the beginning, the BRICS grouping has helped reform the Bretton Woods institutions, has provided more voice to countries in the Global South. But now there's several other initiatives. There's yearly meetings between national security advisors to discuss geopolitics. There are meetings between ministers of education, ministers of transport, of defense, foreign ministers. There's a development bank. And I think these are important places to also think about the future of development, how should development banks operate, etc. So there's now, I think, a massive exchange of ideas. And particularly this year, I think, the BRICS grouping does act as a stabilizer at a time when particularly the US is destabilizing the international system. I think the BRICS will send a message of continuity.
O senhor embaixador está otimista com o resultado desses 10 anos?
Oh yes, no, I'm very optimistic. Like Professor Stuenkel says, that BRICS has actually, and I like the way he puts it, served as a stabilizer, because there is a leadership vacuum now globally, and society can't allow a vacuum. That vacuum has to be filled. It's either filled by anarchists or populists, or it's filled by people who are genuinely interested in the development of humankind in an inclusive manner, in a manner that excludes nobody, in a manner that is sensitive to a changing world, in a manner that makes sure that there is no disease, there is no poverty, in a manner, as an example, the newly established Bank of BRICS. Its approach to dealing with development, I think it will be different from other established institutions, as the professor did say earlier. So I'm quite optimistic with what we can do together. The most important thing that I think BRICS has achieved so far is the idea itself of making sure that the Global South has a voice, and a voice that is not meant to destabilize, but to give further credence to what all other traditional institutions were doing, except that they did not have the inclusive nature that BRICS brings.
O tema da cúpula, dessa 10ª cúpula dos BRICS, é os BRICS na África, cooperação para o crescimento inclusivo e a prosperidade compartilhada na 4ª Revolução Industrial. É uma iniciativa bastante corajosa, né? O que ela pode dizer para a população de nossos países?
The 4th Industrial Revolution, as others call it, I think is taking Africa and the world on a path of sustainable development. But for Africa, what it will do is to integrate the African economy with the global economy. Africa has registered a lot of progress in the past 2 to 3 decades. Africa has now managed to remove from its agenda conflict that has been devastating to our continent. Africa is seriously not just discussing, but doing things that are helping the development of the continent. We are now trying to industrialize the continent. In order to do so, you would need the requisite energy. We're looking at various mix of energy to make sure that industrialization is not in the backbench. But what is in the backbench now is conflict. And it is amazing if you look at the growth of a number of countries, especially in East Africa, like Tanzania, Kenya, well, including Ethiopia as well, where they had growth of over 5%. And a lot of countries in sub-Saharan Africa, since 2017, after the problems of 2016, all of them are growing at about 3.5 and so on. Africa is also a young continent. there is a lot more that with global partnerships we will be able to achieve in Africa. So with the partnerships that we have in BRICS, as the professor was saying, ministers are meeting now on education, on agriculture, on health. These are the issues where solutions come from a community that is prepared to work together.
Professor Stuenkel, como é que o senhor vê a ênfase dada pela cúpula à questão da quarta revolução industrial?
Well, I think in several cases it offers an opportunity because in some cases, some of these countries they were still sort of adapting to, for example, the third wave, and now we're looking at sort of very new trends, the Internet of Things, etc. And I think Africa is an interesting example because we have, for example, mobile banking, which has been adopted actually much quicker than in Europe, for example, because you had a broad investment in sort of more traditional infrastructure, and because that hadn't happened in Africa, you could actually upgrade easier. At the same time, I think we sometimes tend to think that the technological progress and the impact it will have on society, for example, like automation and how that will reduce the need for specific types of labor, is only something that will impact industrialized, rich countries. But it's actually very important to have a discussion about that in developing countries as well, because once these things are implemented, for example, in Europe or in the United States, they can then come very quickly to the rest of the world, and then the changes and the impact they may have on society may be even bigger. And it's also important, worth mentioning, that China has now become really a global leader on dealing with a lot of the, using technology to transform society. In my case, I'm just accompanying several former students of mine who now live in China for mobile banking companies, and now these are being introduced in the Brazilian market. Mm-hmm. And they will certainly transform the way we think about transportation in Brazil. They will also increasingly have a presence in South Africa and India and Russia, etc. So these are examples also that the BRICS countries are no longer, quote unquote, only catching up to develop into something that already exists, but they're also increasingly taking the lead on these things. So I think it's bold. I think you're right. And one may criticize it and say, well, there's still so many basic challenges. Why are you thinking about the fourth revolution? But I think it's particularly important to also say, rather than merely copying debates that are taking place elsewhere, it's important to promote these within the BRICS countries.
Eu gostaria muito de agradecer a presença, então, do professor Stuenkel, do embaixador da África do Sul, que estiveram aqui conosco no estúdio da TV Senado. E se você quiser rever, baixar ou repassar o link, basta visitar a nossa página na internet, senado.leg.br/TV, ou então o canal do TV Senado no YouTube, youtube.com/TV Senado. Para fazer algum comentário, crítica ou sugestão, telefone para o Alô Senado, 0800 61 22 11. Muito obrigado pela sua atenção e até o próximo Cidadania Mundo.